Hello, my name is Ava. I'm going to be talking about two projects today. Primarily, I'm going to be talking about the work that I'm doing for Joe Mullins alongside Riley and Richard, and that is a pretty broad exploration of childcare costs, expenditures, and wages of the industry over time. So the underlying theory behind our research project is that Beaumont's cost disease is affecting the childcare industry. So childcare being a labor-intensive, low productivity industry, it doesn't have the same benefit to productivity increases as most industries do. So as technology advances, you have lower costs per employee and you're able to pay your employees higher wages because of the output that they're producing. But industries that are reliant on human labor cannot achieve the same productivity gains. Musician in 1960 is not producing more than a musician is now at 2025. So, because that productivity remains relatively constant, the price is then passed on to the consumer so that the industry can pay higher competitive wages and remain an employable field. So the assumption that we're operating under here is that this is a bad thing. The more that consumers spend on these labor-intensive childcare services, the other productivity growth across the economy will this will ultimately have a negative effect on that. So the guiding questions and the aspects that we've been looking into are how wages have changed over time in service industries, how costs of childcare have changed over time for the providers, and how much of that money is going back into their employees, and then the percent of income spent on childcare for the consumer, how much of their income are they allocating to service-intensive industries, such as childcare. So we're looking at three things mainly, three aspects of the childcare industry. We want to know the percent of which people are spending on childcare, and we'd use um two surveys for this. We want to know the price that the center is charging for that care. And the cost of care and wages are really what's important for Burnout's cost disease or what we look at for Brunel's cause disease. And we use three databases for that. So we have one that's more broad and then two that report directly from state issued surveys about childcare prices. Um, sorry. And then we're also looking at wages for employees in the childcare industry. And one, I'm not sure what Riley and Richard will be talking about, but I'll talk about the work that I've done more recently. So I've specifically been using this survey, the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages, the QCU is what I call it. And I've also looked at the CPI. What's nice about these two and what makes them easy to work with together is that they both have subsets for childcare and then education more broadly. So you can see the blue lines represents education here, wages, and price index. And I also used 1998 as a base year so that we can see the growth over time. And so what we are looking at here is that childcare is not necessarily following the trends that we would assume it to. So as you can see for education, the price is increasing almost, I think, yeah, what do we have here? 200% compared to 300% for price passed on to consumer. And we would kind of expect childcare to follow the same pattern here, but we actually see childcare wages increasing more than the price of childcare. And so this doesn't really fall into Joe's theory, especially for childcare. The education trends do follow that assumption, but the red lines that we're looking at here do not. And so as I produce these tables, I realized that maybe there's a little bit more breaking down that we need to do. So next thing I've been doing is looking at state differences, public versus private wages specifically. I think this gap or this jump in 2020 is likely in large part due to private versus public childcare industries and how they were able to adapt to COVID markets. And I'd also like to look at the not just the CPI, but we also have these two surveys, the Child Care Aware and the NDCP. I'd like to look at the wages for childcare workers compared to those surveys instead of just the broad CPI values because the CPI values don't necessarily follow the same trend as the other two data sets that we have. And so I'd like to work with the QCU and those other data sets. And hopefully that will better explain this discrepancy post COVID for childcare wages and prices. And my personal project that I've been working on is a voter turnout discrepancy or voter support discrepancy, rather. So in 2022, this highway along the Sunset District was put up for vote after coastal erosion closed the bottom part of the highway permanently. It was put up for vote, and basically they were asking the public, do you want this highway closed, yes or no? And in 2022, people voted across all of the city, no, don't close the highway. It's a major transit hub. There's not a lot of public transit that accesses the Sunset District, and so in 2025, when voters in areas that did not use the or seemingly don't use the highway as a transit route don't live close enough for it to be used as a public park for them. I like to understand better if there's demographic differences between these two districts that made this this part of the city more supportive of keeping the highway open. I'd like to know if wealth is a factor specifically between these two districts. Age is a major factor. So the Sunset District average age is within the 60s to 80s, and the Castro District is far younger than that. So I want to know if it's maybe age of resident that has a big influence in, supporting or not supporting this closure of the highway. And it's also just kind of interesting to see that the area that would not be within immediate influence of the highway closure voted in vast supports to get rid of it and turn it into a public park, which is really more of a privileged stance if this is your direct line to work, groceries, um, other like things that you would need to use, especially if you don't have public transit and if you're an elderly person in this area. So I'm looking specifically at demographics between these different districts and understanding what the reason for voter support was in a policy that seemingly people would support broadly. There's been greater shifts towards increased public transit, especially in San Francisco, which has something that's already so well established. And so it seems like kind of a discrepancy for this old highway that's especially vulnerable to coastal erosion is being supported by the people who live there, instead of a public park, which you would think would have a higher support for its residents. And so I've just been using, I'm not gonna like talk too much about this, but yeah, that's the data I've been using. A lot of it is just demographic data so far, so I can understand the kinds of people who live there and maybe how that would influence their decision. But I also have this completely blue map to show you it's not a political difference. And you might think it is, but actually the the funding behind the two parties that supported and did not support the highway, a lot of the people who wanted to turn it into a park, that was majority funded by like tech companies in the Bay Area. So, you know, maybe there's some outside influencing happening here, and I am looking into that. And sorry I went on this rant at the end. I just really care about this highway closure because in 2025 it was successful and they did close it. And so I just want to know why, what changed between then and 2022. Thank you for listening. Um, Hopefully this is great for you guys.